The walls fell outward. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. And most people who have heard the story of Jericho their entire lives have never been told it. When walls collapse under military assault, they fall inward. The physics are straightforward. Attackers breach from the outside, the pressure moves toward the city, the structure gives way in the direction of the force. Every siege in the ancient world produces the same pattern in the archaeological record. Inward collapse. Rubble on the interior. The city folds in on itself. At Jericho, the walls fell outward. The excavated debris field runs down the exterior slope of the mound. The mud brick that formed the upper sections of the city wall was found at the base of the tell on the outside, as if something pushed from within, or as if the ground itself gave way simultaneously along the entire circuit of the wall before any attacker had touched it. That is not what siege warfare looks like. That is not what any known military technology of the Bronze Age could produce. The site known today as Tell es-Sultan sits in the Jordan Valley, approximately 6 miles north of the Dead Sea. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth. Archaeological evidence of human settlement there stretches back 12,000 years. The spring that feeds it, Elisha's spring, still flows today, producing the same water that made this location worth fighting over for 100 generations before Joshua's army ever appeared on the horizon. The mound itself, the tell, is a layer cake of human history. Every civilization that lived here, built here, burned here, and was replaced by the next civilization left a stratum in the soil. Archaeologists read these layers like pages. Each one is a chapter, and buried inside the specific stratum that corresponds to the late Bronze Age, the period the biblical text places the Israelite conquest, is a chapter that has been argued over, contested, reinterpreted, and argued over again for more than a century. What that layer contains is not what the skeptics predicted, and it is not quite what the Sunday school version prepared you for either. And the story of Jericho in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, is one of the most architecturally specific battle accounts in the entire Bible. 7 priests, 7 trumpets made of ram's horns, 7 days of marching around the city walls in silence. On the 7th day, 7 circuits, and then the shout, and then the collapse. The writer of Joshua is not being vague. He is giving dimensions, personnel counts, procedural details. He is writing like someone who wants the account to be checkable. And for over a century, archaeologists have been checking it. What they found changed the argument entirely. The first serious excavation of Tell es-Sultan began in 1907. A German team led by Ernst Sellin and Karl Watzinger spent 2 seasons cutting into the mound, documenting what they found and publishing their results. Their conclusion, released in 1913, was straightforward, and for many readers of the biblical text, deeply unsettling. The site showed no evidence of a late Bronze Age destruction, no burned layer, no collapsed walls, no signs of a military assault in the period the Bible describes. The walls of Jericho, the German team concluded, had fallen centuries before Joshua arrived. The academic world received this as confirmation of what many had already suspected, that the conquest narrative in Joshua was theological fiction dressed as history, a story invented to give a people a sense of divine mandate over land they had settled gradually, not conquered dramatically. The archaeology, it seemed, had spoken, and then a British archaeologist named John Garstang arrived. Garstang excavated at Jericho between 1930 and 1936. He identified a destruction layer he called City 4, a stratum showing evidence of violent destruction, burned grain, collapsed mud brick walls, and dated it to approximately 1400 BC, which aligned within the range of scholarly debate with the biblical timeline for the conquest. He announced his findings carefully but clearly. The archaeological record at Jericho was consistent with the account in Joshua. The academic response was immediate and largely hostile. Garstang's dating methodology was challenged. His stratigraphic analysis was questioned. And then, between 1952 and 1958, Kathleen Kenyon arrived. Kenyon was one of the most technically rigorous field archaeologists of the 20th century. She pioneered a stratigraphic excavation method that set the standard for the discipline. She was not hostile to the biblical text. She was simply committed to following the evidence wherever it led. And the evidence, she concluded, led away from Garstang. The destruction layer he had identified as City 4, Kenyon argued, dated not to the late Bronze Age, but to the early Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before Joshua. The late Bronze Age levels at Jericho, she found, were almost entirely absent. Erosion, exposure, centuries of weather stripping the upper strata from the mound. Her conclusion, published with meticulous documentation, there was no late Bronze Age city at Jericho to conquer. No city, no walls, no battle. The biblical account, in Kenyon's framework, described an event for which there was simply no archaeological correlate. For several decades, Kenyon's findings dominated the academic conversation. Jericho became the standard example in undergraduate archaeology courses of how biblical maximalism, the reading that treats the biblical text as straightforwardly historical, collides with physical evidence and loses. It was a settled question, until Bryant Wood looked more carefully at what Kenyon had actually found. Wood, an archaeologist specializing in Bronze Age Canaan, spent years working through Kenyon's original field notes, pottery analyses, and unpublished documentation from the 1952-1958 excavations. What he published in 1990 in the Biblical Archaeology Review fundamentally reframed the debate. The problem, Wood argued, was not with what Kenyon found. It was with how she dated it. Kenyon had relied primarily on the absence of a specific type of imported Cypriot pottery, bichrome ware, to conclude that the destruction layer predated the late Bronze Age. This pottery type was common at contemporaneous late Bronze Age sites across Canaan. Its absence at Jericho, she reasoned, indicated the city had not existed in that period. Wood's rebuttal was precise. The absence of imported luxury pottery at Jericho proves nothing about the date of the destruction. It proves only that Jericho, at the time of its destruction, was not importing Cypriot luxury goods, which is exactly what you would expect of a city under siege. A city that knew an enemy army was camped outside its walls, marching around it, in fact, for 7 consecutive days, would not be receiving merchant shipments. Trade would have stopped. The absence of imported pottery in the destruction layer is not evidence of an early date. It is evidence of a city that had been economically isolated before it fell. Most people who have heard of Jericho's walls have never heard of Kathleen Kenyon. If someone in your life assumes the Bible has been disproven by archaeology, send this to them. The story is considerably more complicated than either side usually admits. Wood then turned to the pottery Kenyon had actually found at the site, the locally produced ceramic forms present in the destruction layer, and cross-referenced them against the established typological sequence for late Bronze Age Canaan. His conclusion: the ceramic assemblage in the destruction layer at Jericho is consistent with a date in the late Bronze Age wine period, specifically the 14th century BC, the same century the biblical timeline places the conquest. And then there was the grain. The burned grain stored in the destruction layer at Jericho is one of the most archaeologically significant details in the entire debate, and it is almost never discussed outside specialist literature. Ancient cities that fell to military conquest in the late Bronze Age typically show a specific pattern in their destruction layers. The grain stores are empty or nearly so. Conquering armies consumed what they found. Defending populations ate their reserves during extended sieges. The grain was used up before the city fell. At Jericho, the grain stores were full. Large ceramic jars, found in the destruction layer, still containing carbonized grain, burned in place, sealed by the collapse of the structure above them, preserved for 3,000 years in the ash of whatever fire consumed this city. Full jars, untouched reserves. This is not what a prolonged siege looks like. Extended sieges, which could last months or years in the ancient world, depleted food stores as a matter of survival. A city with full grain jars at the moment of its destruction is a city that fell quickly, too quickly to consume what it had stockpiled. The book of Joshua, chapter 6, describes a siege that lasted 7 days. 7 days is not long enough to deplete a city's grain supply. The archaeology is consistent. And then there is the wall itself. Kenyon's excavations exposed a section of the lower retaining wall, a stone revetment wall at the base of the mound, still standing to a height of approximately 4 meters at the time of excavation. At the base of this wall, on the exterior side, she found a layer of collapsed mud brick debris. The upper mud brick wall had fallen, outward, down the slope, onto the exterior of the site. Kenyon documented this. Garstang had noted the same pattern decades earlier. The debris field runs in the wrong direction for a military assault. The walls of Jericho did not fall because attackers pushed them in. They fell from the outside edge, as if the ground moved. There is one more detail inside the destruction layer at Jericho. One detail that neither the skeptics nor, frankly, most defenders of the biblical account have known what to do with. It sits in the northern section of the excavated mound, in a portion of the city wall that did not collapse. The book of Joshua, chapter 2, tells a story that runs parallel to the main conquest narrative and is easy to treat as a minor subplot. 2 Israelite spies are sent into Jericho before the army arrives. They are discovered. They take shelter in the house of a woman named Rahab, described as a prostitute, living, the text specifies in chapter 2, verse 15, in a house built into the city wall itself. Rahab hides the spies. She negotiates a deal. When the city falls, she and her household will be spared if she hangs a scarlet cord from her window. The spies escape. She hangs the cord. And when the walls of Jericho collapse in chapter 6, the text says in verse 17 that Rahab and her household were the only survivors. Her house, built into the wall, did not fall. Kenyon's excavations identified something in the northern section of the tell that her published reports describe with careful archaeological neutrality, a portion of the lower wall that remained intact through the destruction event, not collapsed, not burned, still standing. Against the interior side of this surviving wall section, the excavation found evidence of modest domestic occupation, small rooms, storage vessels. The material signature of residential use, built directly against and into the wall structure. One house, in the wall, surviving a destruction that leveled everything around it. Kenyon did not connect this to Rahab. She was an archaeologist, not a theologian, and her published work maintained strict disciplinary boundaries. But the location, northern wall, domestic structure, surviving the event that destroyed the rest of the city, matches the textual description with a specificity that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence and equally difficult to confirm as proof. What the archaeology gives us here is not verification, it is possibility. The physical record does not contradict the account, it leaves space for it. And in a site that was supposed to have no late Bronze Age story to tell at all, that is not nothing. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next story goes somewhere the archaeology cannot follow. But here is where the debate gets genuinely interesting, and where both sides of the argument tend to stop reading. Because the question of whether the walls of Jericho fell in the 14th century BC, whether Bryant Wood's reanalysis of Kenyon's pottery is correct, whether the grain jars and the outward collapse and the surviving northern wall section all point to the event described in Joshua is actually the smaller question. The larger question is what the text of Joshua is doing with this story in the first place. Read the conquest narrative in Joshua carefully, and something becomes apparent that the standard archaeological debate almost entirely misses. The writer of Joshua is not primarily interested in the military mechanics of how Jericho fell. He devotes 6 verses to the collapse of the walls. He devotes significantly more space to the ritual, the priests, the ark, the 7 days, the silence, the trumpets, the shout. And then, in a move that stops the narrative completely, he devotes an entire chapter, Joshua chapter 7, to what happens immediately after the victory. A man named Achan from the tribe of Judah violated the ban on taking plunder from Jericho. He took a robe, silver and gold, items the text describes as devoted to destruction, belonging to God, not to the army. He buried them under his tent. The next battle, against the small city of Ai, is a catastrophic Israelite defeat. 36 soldiers killed. The army routed. Joshua falls on his face before God, confused and desperate. And God's answer is not military advice. It is this: there is sin in the camp. The writer of Joshua is making an argument that the archaeological debate has almost no tools to address. The fall of Jericho in this narrative is not primarily evidence of Israelite military superiority or divine favoritism toward a conquering people. It is the setup for a much more uncomfortable point, that the community which receives an extraordinary victory is immediately tested by what it does with the aftermath. That the same God who collapsed walls outward on a Tuesday is equally present when a man buries stolen gold under his tent on a Wednesday. The miracle and the accountability arrive in the same week. This is where the text becomes genuinely difficult in a way that neither the skeptic nor the simple believer tends to engage with honestly. The skeptic wants to debate wall chronology. The simple believer wants to celebrate the miracle. Both postures allow the reader to stay at a comfortable distance from what the narrative is actually demanding. What Joshua demands, structurally, architecturally, in the way the chapters are sequenced, is that the reader sit with the connection between divine intervention and human responsibility. The walls fell. That is remarkable. And then a man stole something, and that is equally the story. Kathleen Kenyon died in 1978. Bryant Wood published his reanalysis in 1990. The debate has continued since then, with additional excavations, revised dating frameworks, and ongoing disagreement among specialists about which pottery typology is most reliable for this period and this site. What has not changed is the destruction layer itself, the burned grain, the outward fallen walls, the surviving structure in the north. Those are not interpretations. They are facts in the ground. What they mean, whether they confirm a biblical account, complicate it, or simply exist alongside it without resolving anything, depends on questions that archaeology was never designed to answer. The Jordan Valley sits today along one of the most contested borders on Earth. The site of es-Sultan is located in the West Bank, administered by the Palestinian Authority, visited by archaeologists and pilgrims and tourists from every tradition and every conclusion. The spring still flows, the mound still rises, the layers are still there, waiting for the next excavation season, the next set of questions, the next generation of researchers who will bring new tools and old debates to the same patch of ground. 3,000 years of argument, and the walls are still outward. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that this story demands, and it is uncomfortable for everyone. For the skeptic, the discomfort is this: The standard academic dismissal of the Jericho account, the version that treats Kenyon's findings as the final word and moves on, turns out to have been premature. The pottery reanalysis is serious scholarship. The grain jars are real. The outward collapse is documented by the archaeologist, who most wanted to find nothing. Dismissing the biblical account of Jericho requires engaging with evidence that the popular version of the dismissal never bothered to address. For the believer, the discomfort is different but equally real. The text of Joshua is not a straightforward triumph narrative. It is a story about a people who received a miracle and then, within days, demonstrated exactly why miracles alone do not produce lasting transformation. Achan's sin is not a footnote. It is the point the writer has been building toward. The walls fell outward, and the harder collapse, the one that takes longer to excavate and longer to understand, happened inside the camp. Both sides of the standard debate are, in their own way, avoiding what the text is actually doing. What's striking, and this is where the physical evidence and the narrative converge in a way that is genuinely difficult to dismiss, is that the details the writer of Joshua chose to include are precisely the details that archaeology would later confirm or complicate. The grain jars, the outward collapse, the house in the wall, the rapid destruction. A writer inventing a conquest story to justify territorial claims. The theory that dominated academic Old Testament scholarship for most of the 20th century would not naturally include these specific details. Invented propaganda tends toward the general and the overwhelming. It does not tend toward the specific and the verifiable. The specificity of Joshua is either the record of someone who was there or the work of a writer so precisely calibrated that the invention accidentally matched the physical record at point after point after point. Both options are remarkable. There is a broader argument underneath this one that the Jericho debate keeps surfacing, no matter how many times the academic conversation tries to bury it. The argument is about what counts as evidence. The 20th century produced a consensus in biblical archaeology that treated absence of evidence as evidence of absence. If the archaeology doesn't confirm it, the text is suspect. Kenyon's Jericho was the flagship case. No late Bronze Age city, therefore no conquest, therefore the narrative is fiction. But absence of evidence is only evidence of absence when the conditions for preservation are met. Jericho sits in a climate of extreme heat and low humidity, on a mound that spent centuries exposed to the elements between occupation periods. The upper Bronze Age strata, the very layers that would contain the evidence of a 14th century destruction, are precisely the layers most vulnerable to erosion. Kenyon found what survived. She could not find what the weather had already taken. That is not a failure of archaeology. It is a limitation of it. And acknowledging that limitation does not prove the biblical account. It simply means the case is not closed in the way that a generation of textbooks claimed it was. The Jordan Valley in 2026 is not so different in certain fundamental ways from the Jordan Valley of 1400 BC. It is still contested ground. Still the subject of competing claims rooted in ancient texts and modern politics simultaneously. Still a place where the question of who was here first and what that means for who belongs here now carries stakes that go far beyond academic archaeology. The tell at es-Sultan sits in this landscape not as a neutral artifact but as an argument. Every excavation season is funded by someone with a position. Every published finding lands in a conversation already charged with centuries of theological, political, and national identity. The walls of Jericho have been falling in one sense or another ever since they first fell. What the physical record insists on, quietly, without taking sides, is that something happened here. Something violent and rapid and structurally anomalous. Something that left grain in jars and walls on the outside of the mound, and a surviving structure in the north that the destruction somehow missed. What that something was, is the question. Archaeology can tell you what is in the ground. It cannot tell you why the ground moved. Type in the ground if the physical evidence changed how you see this story. Type still skeptical if the debate raised more questions than it answered. Or type always believed, because sometimes the most honest response to 3,000 years of argument is just that. The next story in this series goes somewhere the archaeology cannot follow, into the mind of a woman who made a decision that the Book of Judges records in 4 verses, and historians have spent centuries trying to fully explain. Come back for it.